Hey everyone, tonight we dive into something a bit more unsettling. An age of epidemics, punishments, and unappetizing stews. We're going straight into the raw reality of the Middle Ages. Forget the polished castles and knightly tales that Hollywood fed you. The harsh truth, you likely wouldn't survive even a single day. So, before settling in, take a second to like the video and subscribe bonely if you genuinely appreciate this kind of content. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see the mix of people tuning in across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's slip together into tonight's unsettling journey. Congratulations, you've just opened your eyes in the year 1325. The good news, you're breathing. The bad news, so are the fleas. Your mattress is a decomposing pile of straw packed with bugs and hay, still carrying the smell of the barn. Floor where it came from months ago. No memory foam, no pillows, and certainly no luxurious cotton sheets. Just a heavy wool blanket, never washed since last winter, now caked with filth until it weighs nearly as much as a small calf. You blink awake to the tolling of a church bell, the medieval alarm clock loud, unrelenting, and merciless. Your dwelling is a wooden shack with a single room, no windows, and the open plan concept no one asked for, where family, livestock, and insects live in perfect disharmony. The odor, a nauseating orchestra, stale ale, human sweat, goat musk, and what you desperately hope isn't mold, though deep down you know it is. Candles with pleasant scents, not invented yet. And if they were, they'd drip uselessly into the dirt floor. You attempt to stretch, but instantly regret if the air cuts like ice and your joints throb. You're 22 years old, which already places you at the medieval halfway point of life. Your spine creaks like an ancient door hinge, and your knees crunch like a sack of gravel being shaken by a baffled peasant. Rising from bed is a gamble. The floor is either soaked from last night's storm dripping through the thatch, or crusted with whatever your neighbor's chicken left behind. Either way, your bare feet have just joined the ecosystem. Privacy doesn't exist. Your whole family and, maybe a random cousin who never left are all waking up beside you. No bedrooms, no curtains, no personal space. Everything is shared. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe. You're never truly alone, because vermin, insects, and at least 8 other people are always there. And that's just the beginning of your day. Things only get bleaker. Somehow, you manage to crawl out of your straw-filled nightmare. Congratulations. But now nature calls, and it isn't gentle, it's urgent. This is where you start longing for the modern toilet. There's no porcelain bowl, no seat, no paper, no handle to flush, not even a plunger glaring in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is part survival exercise, part public display. For peasants, the bathroom is a wooden bucket behind the house, already overflowing because Uncle Wolfston had one too many rotten turnips. The stench is apocalyptic. You hold your breath, finish quickly, and here comes the fun part. Toss it into the street. Yes, directly into the street. You're supposed to yell an old warning, meaning watch out below. But let's be honest, nobody reacts fast enough. Streets in medieval towns double as open sewers, a flowing cocktail of human waste, animal droppings, and unidentifiable fluids you'd rather never analyze. If you're fortunate enough to live where public latrines exist, good for you. But they're little more than a row of benches where strangers sit elbow to elbow, with zero privacy and air that makes your eyes water. You might exchange polite words, but try not to breathe. Toilet paper doesn't exist. People wipe with hay leaves, rags, moss, or on a luxury day a scrap of wool. Sometimes nothing at all. Which might explain why shaking hands wasn't fashionable yet. And castles. Surely it's better there, right? Not really. You might have a garderobe, essentially a hole in the wall that drops waste straight into the moat. Great idea, except that enemies know this, and sometimes crawl in through the chute. So, whether you're a peasant or a noble, using the toilet is still degrading, public, unsafe, and absolutely revolting. One slip on the stones and you're face first in humanity's leftovers, and you still haven't brushed your teeth. But we'll get to that. Surviving the toilet ordeal almost feels like an accomplishment. Time for breakfast. Think again. This is medieval Europa thing, about food here is comforting. Breakfast, if it even counts, is a sad ritual. Get eggs Benedict, cappuccinos, or toast with avocado. You crouch near the fire with a wooden bowl of something resembling mud scraped from a boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. This is a thick, soupy mush, made of whatever scraps are around. Grains, roots, maybe beans, if fortune smiles. The same pot has been bubbling for days, sometimes weeks, and new ingredients are just dumped on top. It's less a recipe, more a never-ending experiment. Beside it sits bread, so hard you could fend off raiders with it. Made from rye or barley, often bulked up with sawdust or crushed acorns, because fine wheat belongs only to the wealthy. You don't cut it, you wrestle with it. As for drinks, no orange juice or frothy lattes, just ale. Beer, at dawn. Because the water will kill you faster than hunger. Children drink it, too. Nobody enjoys it, but it's survival in liquid form. Meat or cheese. Only on holy days, or if your lord is generous. Fresh fruit. Rare, seasonal, and likely turned to wine before you can taste it. Spices. Forget it, pepper costs more than your monthly income, and salt is guarded like treasure, so you chew on your gritty bread, sip your weak ale, and try not to imagine the rats that may have sampled your porridge overnight. Breakfast doesn't revive you, it simply happens to you. And now, underfed and groggy, it's time to start laboring as if your very existence depends on it, because, in truth, it does. And what about getting dressed? Don't expect variety. Your entire wardrobe is exactly one outfit. A coarse wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every single day for months, maybe years. There's no fashion, no seasons, just wear it until it falls apart or infects your skin. Underwear, optional. If you're lucky, maybe a spare linen piece. If not, you go without. Going without any undergarments beneath layers, of course. Sweaty wool, all painstakingly stitched together by someone who probably didn't even know what a proper seam looked like. There's no washing machine, no soap, and absolutely no dry cleaner in sight. So, your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a compost heap that's been left to soak in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to clean them, it wouldn't be easy. You'd have to carry water from a nearby river, or heat it over a fire. Scrub your tunic on a board with ashes. or lay it out to dry in the sun, which shines for about 3 days a year. And don't even get started on footwear, if you own any. Shoes, they're likely made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants just walk barefoot through mud, dung, and medieval landmines, aka sharp rocks and puddles of disease. All of this leads to one conclusion: your skin absolutely despises you. You itch constantly. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs make themselves at home on your body. Everyone has them: nobles, filthy monks, itchy children, walking insect farms. No one escapes. You'll be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and no one will bat an eyelash. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing, and your scalp is a battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, too bad. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You just endure. If you're lucky enough to avoid an infection, great, this rash will just be your unwanted medieval sidekick for the next 6 months. Now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in discomfort, it's time to head outside and start working yourself to the bone. Fully dressed in itches and damp wool, it's time to force out a morning smile. Except you don't. Because, in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous act, not emotionally, but dentally. There are no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is as popular as bathing, meaning not very. Some might chew on a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are left to fend for themselves, and they're not doing well. By the time you reach your mid-20s, your smile looks like it belongs to something pulled from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth, that's decay. You have more rot in your mouth than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, while not widespread yet, is becoming more common among the wealthy. Imported at great cost, mostly used in cakes or to show off one's wealth. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to rot your teeth faster than peasants. If you're poor, you'll do it slowly over the years, chewing fermented bread, gritty porridge, and enduring hard work. Toothaches, get used to them. They're as constant as the weather in the Middle Ages, always in the background. The kind of pain that makes you want to pray, drink, or pull out the tooth yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke, was the actual treatment. Dentists didn't really exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same person who cuts your hair also pulls your teeth out by candlelight with an iron hook and no anesthesia. An infected tooth. Hope you like fevers, because without antibiotics, it could quickly turn into sepsis and kill you. That's right, something that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no relief in the social realm either. Kissing, good luck, bad breath, halitosis, is everywhere. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile. You're judged by your land and livestock. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. Now that your teeth are throbbing, let's head outside, because your real job, the one that will break your back, is just getting started. Time to work. Except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, and no chance for a promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Don't die while laboring for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you work the land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't remember your name. You rise with the sun and stop only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones are still intact in your body. There's no weekend, no punching out. Just sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sundays are off, but only if you're not harvesting, fighting off raiders, or praying that your infected toe stops turning black. The work is brutal. Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen, if you're lucky enough to afford one. You dig ditches, plant seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine starts resembling the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one asks about your mental health if you're a woman. Surprise, you don't just do field work. You also care for children. Clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't migrating to your side of the bed. Children start helping at age 5. No school, no toys. Just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of not dying from the flu. And if you're one of the lucky few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. Great, you still work with fire, chemicals, or animal guts all day in poorly ventilated sheds. The pay barely enough to survive. The perks, occasional bleeding, breaking a bone. Too bad, get a fever. Drink some warm beer and keep going. You can't afford to stop, not even for a day. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. Replacement. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career, it's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is on fire from laboring in the fields, let's talk about the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature isn't about seasons, it's about the ongoing punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, and no weatherproofing. Just wooden walls with gaps big enough to toss a chicken through your windows. Covered with cloth, not glass. The fire and the hearth. Nice in theory, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going because wood is expensive. And gathering it from the forest can be illegal. Yes, you could be executed for picking the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your one damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen. Your feet are permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers are so stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite, it isn't diagnosed, it's just bad luck. Now, fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home turns into a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers, but you can't remove them because showing too much skin is scandalous and invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment. Flies are everywhere, attracted to your unwashed body and the smell of last week's goat stew still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear as you sleep, assuming you can sleep through the noise of neighbors yelling and babies crying. In the fields, the sun bakes you. No sunscreen, no hatton, lest you fashioned one from straw like a desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work, heatstroke. It's just called taking a bad turn, so you're either shivering in your own home, wondering if your toes will make it through winter, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks as your thighs chafe into oblivion. The one thing that never changes, no matter the season. Your clothes still itch, your food is still terrible, and your next job is still waiting. Welcome to medieval climate control. There is none. Feeling thirsty, want to freshen up, want to splash a bit of water on your face to wake up from this damp, fevered dream of a life. Too bad. In the Middle Ages, water isn't your friend, it's trying to kill you quietly. In the final days, you find yourself sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach and reflecting on all the decisions that led you here. The next time you take a sip of tap water, raise a glass for our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of hydration without risk. So you drank the water, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock that seemed to mock your existence. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is little more than polite torture with a theology degree. Let's start with the diagnosis. Everything that's wrong with you, whether it's a cough, a rash, a broken bone, or the creeping plague, is caused by your humors being out of balance. The four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black. Bile were believed to govern your health, and keeping them balanced was crucial, like trying to maintain an internal soup. Got a fever? Too much blood. The solution: bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life force into a bowl using a dull blade or a ravenous leech. And yes, barbers were often the ones doing it. Imagine sitting for a haircut while getting a blood extraction at the same time. 2-for-1 special. Anyone feeling sad or anxious? Clearly, that's an excess of black bile. The treatment: laxatives. Perhaps a warm herbal purge, or simply prayers. And a cold compress while everyone avoids eye contact with you and starts making plans for your inevitable coffin. If you break a bone or suffer a serious wound, you're really in trouble. There's no anesthesia, unless you count passing out from the pain. Surgery is done with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over fire, not for sterilization, but because they look more intimidating that way. Antibiotics are centuries away, and germ theory hasn't even been conceived yet. Disease is believed to come from bad air or the wrath of God due to your moral shortcomings. Got a stomachache? It must be your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy confessing while throwing up. If your condition worsens, you'll be treated with more leeches, possibly crushed beetles, and a priest by your side giving last rites, just in case. At this point, they're preparing for the one true cure: death. And if, by some miracle, you recover, everyone will assume God took pity on you. The doctor will take full credit, and the leech will get a promotion. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine was less about healing and more about surviving the treatment. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, it's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hovel, stomach growling, ready for the one joy left in life: a warm meal. Bad news. Your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation doesn't exist. No fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the hope that the cold winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're lucky enough to have any, has been hanging for days, covered in flies, soaking in dubious brine, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet. But even that isn't safe. In years of bad harvests, desperate peasants bulk it up with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. And if it's rye season, there's an added bonus: a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables, only if they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage. Which, if you remember, is basically a hot swamp of mystery ingredients that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be available in the fall, but it rots quickly, and sugar is rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese last a bit longer, but they're crawling with bacteria. People eat them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or chew on boot leather. And let's talk about seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg, worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. If you're caught poaching a rabbit, you could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, tour dinner could get you hanged. So as you sit down to eat your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember that every bite is a risk, but you eat it anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. It's evening now. You've worked, suffered, and barely managed to digest your suspicious stew. You might think the day is winding down, but don't get too comfortable, because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely rat you out if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just part of life, it is life. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education if you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is structured around prayer bells. The town church bell rings in the morning, at noon, and at night, not because people need reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. Forget to bow. Sin. Eat meat on a Friday. Sin. Think about your neighbor's wife in a dream. Double sin. And yes, hell is very real. Vividly real. Priests describe it in glorious detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation certainly will. You can't read the Bible yourself because it's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble kid who's too good for dirt. You rely on the church to interpret everything for you. That means if the priest says your crop failure is because you didn't pray hard enough, well, it's time to kneel even harder. Tithes, 1/10 of everything you own, are mandatory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, congratulations, you're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holidays. They're holy days, dozens of them. And while they offer breaks from labor, they're not for fun. Therefore, attending Mass, fasting, confessing sins, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church is dangerous. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are quickly reformed. So you go through the motions. You chant, you bow. You pray that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered life, might finally land in paradise, assuming the priest likes you. Because in the Middle Ages, God may be merciful, but the Church, not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was rough, try doing it as a woman. All the filth, famine, and fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman is like being on hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. From birth, a girl's life path is pretty much locked in: marry young, bear children, serve your husband, and die tired. Education, not likely, unless you're from a noble family and sent to a convent. Your intellectual development stops around the time you learn how to churn butter and patch a tunic. Marriage happens early, really early. It's not weird to be betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14. It's not about love. It's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion isn't required. Once married, you're essentially your husband's property. Your job is to produce heirs, feed everyone, keep the house running, and not complain. Because complaining might get you labeled a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a complimentary drowning or burning, depending on local fashion. Childbirth is a death lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives do their best, but even minor complications can mean death for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many don't survive any. But don't worry. Once the baby is born, your work increases. Now you have a screaming infant in a lice-ridden hut, and you're expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still help in the fields. You don't get a break. You are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable. If you're outspoken, you're dangerous. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they had herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or just looked at someone funny on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role is limited. Nuns lived under strict rules. No speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual worth always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you're expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally, while smiling. Because even in a time of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far you've battled filth, starvation, social injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when you think your day can't get any worse, here comes violence, loud, bloody, and often completely acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. The idea of law and order mostly meant hoping the local lord wasn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere. In the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church disputes, and sometimes in line at the communal bread oven. Crime is common. Punishment is brutal. And justice is more performance art than protection. Steal a loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much. You meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth. For correction, of course. Let's say you're accused of something serious: heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? By being tortured, obviously. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One version, you stick your hand in boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option, you're thrown into a river. If you sink, you're innocent but probably dead. If you float, you're guilty and will be punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host is actively rooting against you. And if you're sentenced to death, that's a public event. Executions are performed in front of cheering crowds, hangings, burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of cable TV, domestic violence, completely normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street fights were commonplace. You could be beaten just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse. And war was always simmering: local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone's always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence wasn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It was society. Everyone lived with the constant knowledge that life was fragile, justice was arbitrary, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So, walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone with a club. At this point, you've made it through the lice, the leeches, the laundreless misery, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early and unglamorous death. If you're alive past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be called the Old One, which is less a nickname and more a statistical miracle. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years. But that number is dragged down heavily by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children die before reaching the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one bad winter could take you out. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survive childhood, you enter adulthood already exhausted. Work begins as soon as you can walk upright, and by the time you're 25, your joints creak like an old monastery door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women face a particularly deadly gauntlet: childbirth, one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bleed out on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the dangers are different, but just as relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, a crusade gone wrong. Even walking to the market could be risky if you cross paths with a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could come quietly from the plague, which turned cities into cemeteries overnight, or from famine, which could last entire seasons and thin out entire villages, or from bad luck like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. Funerals, you were lucky if you got one. Bodies were buried quickly to avoid disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow mound of earth. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's move on to your final chapter, the medieval dream. It dies. Catherine didn't shy away from her relationships. In fact, She often rewarded her lovers with titles, land, and pensions if they behaved accordingly. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most significant of these lovers was Gregory P.M. a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even secretly married together. They shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Pemcan wasn't just a lover, he was her co-ruler in many ways. However, Europe couldn't ignore the scandal. Gossip spread, and satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. After her death, the rumors only grew worse, with the most infamous being the grotesque and completely false tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies to tarnish her legacy. Why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically. In a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed that pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships didn't have to undermine public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, something few male rulers ever managed to do. In reality, her relationships were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful. When they stopped being useful, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared for all her charisma and control. Catherine's reign was not without peril. In 1773, that peril came in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelian Pugachev. He wasn't just any rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the German usurper. It was absurd. Peter was long gone. But to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words lit a fire across the Volga River region, especially among Cossack peasants and old believers. In a time when the gap between nobles and serfs had brutally widened, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were taken, fortresses fell, nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though the empire itself might fracture. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within her own people, rising against the system. But Catherine didn't panic. She acted. She dispatched professional military forces to crush the rebellion ruthlessly. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a public warning to all who dared follow. Afterward, Catherine doubled down on order and control. Her dreams of liberating the serfs quietly faded into silence. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility, who offered loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The empress, who once quoted Voltaire, now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reform became cautious. Surveillance increased. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out before it had a chance to breathe. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a warning that haunted Catherine. Power built on inequality could only hold for so long before the storm came. Crashing through, by the time Catherine the Great approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades. Longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she had defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Catherine's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military victories. They were strategic pivots, securing warm water ports, and reshaping trade. But her legacy wasn't only drawn on maps. Catherine left a cultural mark as well. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe, and corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine firmly placed Russia on the cultural map. She modernized education, founded schools for girls, and promoted the printing of books. She even introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, publicly receiving the vaccine herself, courageous act of scientific bravery in her time. Yet, her reign was also one of contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom deeper into Russia's territories. Her reforms, while impressive, remained mostly top-down, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power wasn't inherited. It was crafted, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: a user, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Catherine didn't just reign. She ruled with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her power, expansion, and enduring legacy, Catherine the Great was still at her core. A woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her image. Behind the imperial portraits and state decrees was someone deeply aware of how precarious her position was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that didn't want a woman in charge. And yet, she not only endured, she thrived. Catherine was never content to be ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was intense. Hours of reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court filled with rival factions. She wasn't content to simply sit on the throne. She worked the throne like a stateswoman born to it. She was also, in many ways, lonely. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, yet wrote in her memoirs of how few people she could truly trust. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and kept away from state matters, grew into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Her greatest emotional partnership with Gregory P.M. faded into deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Catherine crafted her image carefully. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it better than most monarchs of her age. She posed as the mother of Russia, an enlightened monarch, a warrior, empress, and lover of the arts. But beneath those roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her by the title she never gave herself, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless or kind or just. It was because she took power and wielded it on her own terms in a time and place where women weren't supposed to have any. She didn't just wear the crown. She rewrote what it meant to deserve one. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I experienced 2 accidents in my life. One was when a streetcar hit me. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an unusual pairing in the eyes of outsiders. Diego large, unfaithful, and politically famous. Frida sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, and already walking with a cane. Her parents referred to it as a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was intense but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter. But he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Christina. Frida was devastated, and in return, she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, but remarried a year later with different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, and her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her, wounded her, but also believed in her as an artist, a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be, together. They were not peaceful, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, leaving her with a deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment in letters home. She mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself out of vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly in pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, and exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotionally canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tijuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined. In her work, while Rivera painted murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacán became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, exotics, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, flowers in her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more political. Works like the two Fridas revealed a divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said. "But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with symbolism, skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland, while unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, torso bound in corsets, fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico, not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still, she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In the broken column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain for Frida was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile, doctors told her she couldn't attend, so she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed, dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own work. She greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, La Casa Azul, in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She became a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, unibrow gaze, flowers in her hair became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text, and her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere. Printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face. It's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional, and she didn't care to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different. Her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She's become more than an artist. She's a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she's a daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column aren't just seen. They're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction. A communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable, and through it all, she painted, not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself, and in doing so, told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance. We see Frida not gone but immortal. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose identity dissolved in the slow erosion of history. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Zakbu Ajah, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The absence of a glyph naming her is not necessarily an omission, it may have been a choice. A ritualized anonymity meant to elevate her beyond individuality. In Maya cosmology, identity was not confined to a personal name. The soul did not survive through monuments of stone alone, but through ritual cycles, sacred colors, and the rhythms of the cosmos. In this sense, the Red Queen survives more profoundly in her silence than she might have in carved words. She remains suspended between history and myth, remembered not in hieroglyphs, but in cinnabar and secrecy. To truly understand the Red Queen, we must descend into the world that shaped her, a world where Maya women, particularly those of royal blood, wielded immense power, often unseen by modern interpretations. In Maya political culture, lineage was everything. Royal women embodied dynastic continuity, their marriages sealed alliances, their blood sanctified kingship, and their rituals connected human society to divine order. They were not ornamental, they were central. Take Sokok, the formidable mother of Pakal the Great. When Palenque's throne was empty, she stepped into the vacuum, ruling as regent. She commissioned constructions, issued rulings, and safeguarded the dynasty until her son reached maturity. She ensured that power passed not into chaos but into the hands of her lineage. Without her, the dynasty might have collapsed. With her, Pakal was prepared to become the most illustrious ruler of Palenque. This was not an isolated example. In Lady Zouk pierced her tongue with a thorned cord to conjure ancestral visions, acts of sacrifice that legitimated her husband's reign. In Naranjo, Lady Six Sky led warriors into battle, adopting male regalia and embodying a fusion of queen and king. In colloquial depictions, show women conducting ceremonies with as much prominence as their male counterparts. In Tickle, alliances were cemented not by men but through the bloodlines of women exchanged in dynastic marriages. This recognition forces us to reframe the Red Queen. Her burial, opulent, symbolic, and deliberately placed, was not that of a secondary figure. It was the burial of someone who embodied cosmic legitimacy. Her jade funerary mask was not a simple adornment. Jade was the stone of life, breath, and fertility. To cover her face with it was to grant her an eternal identity recognizable to the gods. The cinnabar powder that suffused her bones was more than decoration. To the Maya, red was the color of blood, sacrifice, and regeneration. By enveloping her corpse in it, the living ensured that her death became a seed for rebirth. She did not simply die, she transformed. Her tomb itself deepens. The mystery. Nestled inside Temple 3, it lies in direct dialogue with the grand temple of the inscriptions, where Pakal rests. These temples were not architectural accidents. They were deliberate cosmological statements. Their placement within the sacred landscape mirrored celestial alignments, myths of creation, and dynastic memory. Temple 3 was modest in exterior grandeur compared to its neighbor. Yet inside it concealed something profoundly intimate. A sealed crypt, untouched for over 1,300 years. Archaeologists had to descend steep, narrow stairs to reach the chamber. A descent that mirrored the symbolic journey into the underworld. Unlike Pakal's tomb, with its intricately carved lid, the Red Queen's chamber was bare, no murals, no glyphs, no inscriptions. This silence was not emptiness. It was deliberate. It forced the living not to read her, but to sense her, to imagine her beyond words. At the heart lay her sarcophagus, a limestone vessel echoing Pakals. His lid depicts cosmic rebirth, the king at the center of the world tree, ascending to godhood. Hers was undecorated, focusing not outward but inward on her body, on her cinnabar, on the ritual of death itself. Yet, even in its austerity, meaning emerged. The tomb was aligned east to west, following the sun's eternal path. To bury her so was to tie her destiny to the daily rebirth of light. She became, in architecture as in spirit, part of the eternal cycles of cosmos. Her burial offerings tell the rest of the story. Bone needles, obsidian blades, tokens of bloodletting, perhaps her own tools in life, or symbolic reenactments in death. Ceramic vessels, once filled with maize, gruel, cacao, pulque, or water, provided sustenance for her journey through Xibalba, the Maya underworld. Stingray spines spoke of sacrifice, while shell trumpets carried the echoes of ritual calls to the gods. Every object was both practical and cosmic, equipping her not only for survival but for transformation. To the Maya, death was a crossing. Xibalba was no paradise, it was a realm of trials, illusions, rivers of blood, and death gods who tested the souls of mortals. Only through proper ritual preparation could one survive its labyrinth and emerge into rebirth. The Red Queen's burial was a careful choreography, ensuring her soul's success. Wrapped in cinnabar, crowned in jade, and armed with sacred tools, she was transformed from mortal woman into cosmic ancestor, and her proximity to Pakwel tells us even more. If Pakwel embodied the sun, descending each night into darkness to rise anew, then the Red Queen was the moon, silent, luminous, cyclical. Together, their tombs formed a cosmic dyad, sun and moon, masculine and feminine, life and death, king and queen. In death as in life, they were partners in a divine order larger than either of them, yet she remains nameless, and perhaps that is her greatest power. In anonymity, she becomes archetype, every queen, every priestess, every mother of kings. She forces us to confront the selective nature of memory. Why were the names of kings carved in stone, while the women who made kings possible were often left in silence? Her tomb challenges us to reconsider the balance of power in the Maya world, to acknowledge the hidden half of history. When her crypt was discovered in 1994, archaeologists were stunned by the preservation. For centuries, looters had stripped Palenque of treasures, yet this chamber remained intact, untouched by human hands since antiquity. As researchers uncovered her body, painted red with cinnabar, and lifted her jade mask, they realized they were looking into the face of a mystery. Studies have since attempted to identify her through bone analysis, isotopes, and DNA, but results remain inconclusive. Her identity slips between possibilities, never fully settling, and perhaps this is appropriate. The Red Queen resists definition. She exists not as a solved puzzle, but as an open question, echoing across time. She remains nameless, but not voiceless, silent, but not forgotten. She commands not only the respect of history, but the fascination of the present. The Red Queen may have reigned beside Pakal in life, but in death she reigns over something greater. the imagination of all who encounter her. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story written in silence. And still, she speaks. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose identity dissolved in the slow erosion of history. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Zakbu-Ajah, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The lack of an inscription may not have been an oversight, may have been deliberate. In Maya cosmology, memory did not always reside in words carved in stone. It lived in ritual, in blood offerings, in cosmic cycles, and in the silent whispers of the earth itself. And so, the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth. A woman remembered not in glyphs, but in scarlet dust and silence. To understand the Red Queen, one must step back into the world she came from. A world in which Maya women, especially royal women, held influence far greater than is often acknowledged today. Politics was inseparable from family, and royal women were at the center of dynastic strategies. They were not passive consorts, seated behind their husbands. They were diplomats, ritual leaders, and power brokers. They mediated alliances through marriage, secured legitimacy through their bloodlines, and officiated in ceremonies that bound the human world to the divine. Consider Skak, the formidable mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palenque lay vacant, she did not fade into obscurity. She ruled openly as queen regent until her son came of age. She issued decrees, commanded construction projects, and ensured continuity in a time of crisis. Without her, Pakal might never have risen to become the most celebrated king of Palenque. And she was far from unique. In Yaxchilan, Lady Zouk was depicted piercing her tongue with a thorned rope, summoning visions of gods in a bloodletting ritual. In Naranjo, Lady Six Sky led armies and was portrayed as a warrior queen. In Calakmul, women were depicted side by side with kings, performing sacred rites that elevated their dynasties. The Maya world was not a stage reserved only for men. It was a theater in which women could also stand in the spotlight. This context transforms the Red Queen's burial from mystery into meaning. She may not have ruled in her own name, yet the grandeur of her tomb suggests she was central to Palenque's cosmic and political order. Her jade mask was more than decoration, it was a spiritual instrument, a face preserved for eternity, so that the gods would recognize her soul. The cinnabar that covered her body, staining her bones crimson, was not mere ritual powder. It was the color of life, blood, and rebirth. To coat her in it was to transform her death into regeneration, tying her essence to the endless cycles of the cosmos. Her burial place itself speaks volumes. Hidden within Temple 3, modest in size yet monumental in meaning, her tomb stood in sacred conversation with the Temple of the Inscriptions, the eternal home of Pakal. The architecture was deliberate. Temples in Maya cities were machines aligned to celestial movements, built to mirror creation myths, and designed as portals between the human and the divine. To place the Red Queen here was to inscribe her into that sacred geometry. The tomb's east-west alignment echoed the journey of the sun, suggesting she was meant to walk the same eternal path through night and day. Death and rebirth. Inside, the crypt bore a different kind of silence. Unlike Pakal's richly inscribed sarcophagus lid, hers was undecorated. Perhaps this was humility, or perhaps it was something more profound. A tomb without words becomes a tomb of mystery, a blank canvas onto which ritual and myth could be projected endlessly. It forces us to ask not only who she was, but why her identity was veiled. And yet, she was not buried alone. Around her lay offerings of immense symbolic weight, bone needles and obsidian blades, reminders of auto-sacrifice, the sacred act of shedding royal blood to nourish the gods. Ceramic vessels, perhaps once filled with maize, gruel, cacao, or fermented drinks, were sustenance for her voyage into Xibalba, the Maya underworld. Stingray spines and shells evoked rituals of bloodletting and music, the instruments of divine communication. Every item was intentional. Every offering was a tool for the soul's journey. To the Maya, death was never an ending but a crossing. The underworld of Xibalba was imagined as a place of trials and illusions, governed by death gods who tested the souls of the dead. Only those properly prepared, ritually armed, and cosmologically protected could navigate its labyrinthian paths. The Red Queen, cocooned in cinnabar and encircled with offerings, was not simply being buried, she was being equipped. Her passage was that of a priestess and a queen, moving not into oblivion but into transformation. If Pakul was the sun, descending each night to rise again, then the Red Queen may have been the moon, mysterious, cyclical, and eternal. Together, their tombs embody a cosmic duality, a balance of masculine and feminine, sky and earth, order and ritual. Their closeness in death suggests a unity that transcended life, not a queen behind her king, but beside him, their destinies interwoven. In both politics and myth, though her name has dissolved into silence, the Red Queen endures as more than an anonymous figure. She forces us to reconsider assumptions about the Maya world, where women's power was real, visible, and sacred. Her tomb, sealed for over 13 centuries, speaks not only of her status, but of her role as a bridge between dynasties, between gods and mortals, between life and death. She remains nameless, but never voiceless. Wrapped in cinnabar, resting in stone, she continues to whisper across time. The Red Queen may have commanded a kingdom in life, but in death she governs something greater, our imagination. Her story is written not in glyphs but in absence, not in words but in symbols. And in that silence, she becomes eternal. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, vast stretches of Poland, and long portions of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military triumphs recorded in dispatches, they were profound strategic pivots that altered the very fabric of Russia's destiny. By securing warm water ports, Catherine opened the empire to year-round maritime access, a dream that had eluded rulers before her. Trade routes were reshaped, commercial possibilities multiplied, and Russia positioned itself as a power that could no longer be ignored in European affairs. These conquests were not random victories. They were carefully calculated moves on the grand chessboard of global politics. But Catherine's legacy wasn't drawn only on maps of conquest. She etched her influence into the cultural and intellectual life of her empire. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, which began as her private collection and soon grew into one of the greatest art repositories in Europe. She amassed thousands of works, rivaling the collections of Paris and Vienna. and in doing so, transformed St. Petersburg into a city that foreign visitors began to call the window to Europe. Catherine corresponded with the leading minds of the Enlightenment: Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, absorbing their ideas, debating with them, and using their words as both inspiration and political tools. Her court became not just a seat of power, but a theater of sophistication, ambition, and philosophical inquiry. In a country often viewed as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine put Russia firmly and unapologetically on the cultural map. She modernized education, founding schools for girls at a time when women's education was considered frivolous. By many, she promoted the printing of books, dramatically increasing the circulation of knowledge in her empire. And, in one of her most daring acts, she introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, publicly receiving the vaccine herself in an era when fear and superstition made such measures dangerous to attempt. It was an act of scientific bravery, a deliberate performance to show her people that progress demanded courage. Yet her reign was riddled with contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never abolished serfdom. In fact, she extended it deeper into the territories she conquered, binding millions of peasants more tightly to the land. Her reforms, new legal codes, administrative reorganizations, and grand proclamations remained mostly designed to polish the surface of the empire rather than dismantle its feudal foundations. And yet, within those limits, Catherine's rule still brought stability, growth, and vision. She understood with ruthless clarity that power was not a birthright. It was something seized, defended, and constantly negotiated. She reigned not through divine ordination but through sheer force of will, relentless calculation, and political brilliance. She was called many things: usurper, tyrant, seductress, reformer, but above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a throne more secure, an empire more expansive, and a legacy so commanding that even her fiercest enemies grudgingly acknowledged her genius. Catherine didn't just reign, she ruled, crafting her authority with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. In doing so, she transformed herself from an empress into something far greater, a myth. For all her power, expansion, and cultural triumphs, Catherine remained, at her core, a woman navigating and ultimately reshaping a world built by men. Behind the gilded portraits and carefully staged decrees was someone deeply aware of her precarious position. She had not been born Russian. She had seized power through a coup, toppling her own husband. She presided over an empire that did not easily accept a woman at its helm. And yet, against every expectation, she not only endured, she flourished. Catherine was never content to be ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, and pursued knowledge as if it were another form of conquest. Her daily life was consumed by the business of ruling, reading reports, drafting and editing decrees, corresponding with foreign dignitaries, overseeing the ever-shifting factions of her court. She treated the throne not as a symbol to sit upon, but as a tool to wield, sharpened by the discipline of a stateswoman who understood that idleness meant weakness. And yet, despite her brilliance, she was often lonely, surrounded by admirers, lovers, and opportunists. She admitted in her memoirs that few were truly worthy of her trust. her son Paul became her greatest anxiety. Distrusted and excluded from power, he grew into a man Catherine feared might undo the empire she had so meticulously shaped. Her most profound emotional bond with her lover and confidant Gregory Potemkin outlasted passion and transformed into an enduring partnership. His death in 1791 left a hollow space in her life, a wound that never truly healed. Catherine understood that power was also theater. She carefully crafted her image, embodying roles as mother of the nation, enlightened monarch, warrior empress, and patron of the arts. She knew that appearances could be as decisive as armies, but beneath the surface lay a woman who had endured scandal, rebellion, betrayal, and endless scrutiny and survived each trial by sheer resilience. When she died in 1796, she left an empire transformed but also unfinished. The questions linger. Could she have dismantled serfdom had she dared risk revolt? Did her Enlightenment ideals ultimately yield to political necessity? Was she more philosopher queen or pragmatic autocrat? History gave her the title she never claimed for herself, the Great, not because she was flawless or benevolent, but because she seized power in a hostile world and wielded it with audacity on her own terms. She didn't merely wear the crown, she redefined what it meant to deserve one. About divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress, the court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, grumbled in corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'etat, supported by key military officers, including her lover, Gregory Orlov, and his influential brothers. She rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle, but her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her power, but she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people. Even if she herself ruled with absolute authority, Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakaz, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, one that spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical, but Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia, vast, feudal, deeply conservative land, ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs, to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act, a philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern in her terms. And that meant reform, yes. But with an iron hand in a velvet glove, Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not just to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory, they were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian tsars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, along with Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition, in 1795, Poland was erased from the map, and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies. She also colonized with ideas. New cities were built. Trade routes were expanded. German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone, for all her brilliance and power. Catherine the Great was just as famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them. Many decades younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions. If they behaved well, if not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Gregory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, he was her coroller in many ways. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal. Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumors only got worse, the most infamous being the completely false and grotesque tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically. And in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships didn't have to threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers managed. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful. And when they ceased to be, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. For all her charisma and control, Catherine's reign was not without peril. And in 1773, that peril came in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemulian Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. According to him, he had survived the coup, and now returned to reclaim the throne from the German usurper. It was absurd. Peter was long gone, but to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words lit a fire across the Volga River region, especially among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers. In a time when the gap between nobles and serfs had widened brutally, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were taken, fortresses fell, nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the empire itself might fracture. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within her own people, rising against the very system she ruled. About divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, grumbled in corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'état, supported by key military officers, including her lover, Gregory Orlov, and his influential brothers. She rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle, but her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her power. But she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russian, just militarily or politically, but intellectually, while Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers. Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people. Even if she herself ruled with absolute authority, Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakaz, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, one that spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical. but Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia vast. Feudal, deeply conservative land, ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs. To keep them loyal, this was Catherine's balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern in her terms. And that meant reform, yes. But with an iron hand and a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not just to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory, they were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe, under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin. Russia captured key regions including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian Tsars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, along with Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was erased from the map and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies, she also colonized with ideas. New cities were built, trade routes were expanded, German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea, and through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them, many decades younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions, if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Gregory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia.